All right, let's do it. Hey, Brianne, how you doing?
Hey, Michael, how are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us. This is really exciting. So we have a
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
in the chat. This is a great way to wrap up. I have a handful of questions that are interesting things to chat about. I'm curious, like what you'd like to dive into. I was thinking to get started, it'd be great for you to give a quick introduction about yourself, what you focused on, maybe some of the deals that you've put together, some of the investing that you've done, and just to give people a better sense of you before we dive in.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm Brianne Kimmel. I'm the founder and managing partner of a new future work focused fund called WorkLife. The entire vision of the fund was based on my experience working on go-to-market at Zendesk. And so I started the fund less than a year ago today. We've made about 20 investments, primarily focused on the consumerization of enterprise. So looking at developer tools, workplace productivity, spending a lot of time these days on developer-friendly infrastructure. And the firm is backed by amazing sector-aligned CEOs, the CEO of Zoom, CEO of Slack, and we have a really good community that we've built around the companies that we back. The whole vision was essentially, can you take something, can you take a broad theme such as the consumerization of enterprise? Can you invest in leading technologies that start with a more community-led go-to-market? Can we start to introduce more scalable and primarily product-led growth strategies? And can we ultimately help companies find product market fit faster? While I was at Zendesk, I joined at a really interesting inflection point. The company had historically been primarily self-serve. I joined with a great team on the go-to-market side to start to layer in scalable, more sales-led playbooks. And so, Michael, it's great to join the conversation today. I think that what WorkOS is doing is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's something that consistently comes up. Specifically with companies that start more bottom up, there's always this question of, do you need to build for both? Do you need engineers working on both self-serve and more, sales related features? And do you actually start do you need to hire a sales team? And when does that actually need to happen? And so I love what WorkOS is doing as far as making it really streamlined and easy for companies to go enterprise faster. Because I have experienced that firsthand, what it's like when you're building two go-to-market motions and essentially hiring two separate teams and trying to find ways for them to integrate in the most efficient way possible.
When do you think is the right time for companies to start thinking about that? You invest a lot at the earliest stages when people are just getting started and they have that first bit of traction. If you were to kind of think when you would start advocating for people to start thinking about that, maybe not even necessarily big enterprise, but just kind of like bigger teams and organizations, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I always like to start from first principle and go back to what your customers are asking for. And I feel like there's a lot of nuance in that answer simply because I spend a lot of time with early stage startups. I also spend a lot of time with founders and friends in the network who are more growth stage startups. And the thing that I hear the most is, oftentimes companies overestimate their ability to stay fully self-serve. They also underestimate the power of enterprise. And so I find in a lot of ways, I usually look at, what are the feature requests that are coming in? More importantly, what are the low-hanging revenue opportunities that you're potentially saying no to? And I think in enterprise, that's actually a really important signal, because if you're not building that for a customer who needs it today, who is actively inbounding, someone else is going to build that. And so that actually creates a lot of these opportunities where it is possible to have something like a Dropbox in a box, because if anything, Dropbox had such an amazing self-serve motion, but historically underinvested in enterprise, which created a significant amount of white space for a company like Box. And so I think it all comes back to, what problems are you trying to solve for your customers? And, looking, 6 to 12 months ahead, are you already starting to see signals where there are large enterprise contracts that are potentially coming in, or you are in the short term turning away revenue when you could be moving up market faster than anticipated?
And it sounds like a lot of folks in your LP base, the folks that are behind the fund, have gone through this process too. You mentioned like Stuart from Slack. I mean, they've made this transition in a huge way over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I would say, I mean, even looking, at other developer tools that are part of the ecosystem, I think in a lot of ways, what's awesome and why I love early stage is it's very product and engineering focused. And so I spend most of my time with very technical co-founders. A lot of us have studied computer science or spend most of our time building great products. And I think that is, that's such a blessing and a curse. I think the great thing is like the ability to actually build fast, ship things, like listen to customers and iterate. I think oftentimes what's interesting is how hard the go-to-market aspect of the business truly is if you're heads down and focused on product, and potentially you're missing on some of these external signals that the market can easily pull you into new directions, but those new directions can be bigger, more exciting, larger contracts, more repeatable revenue sooner. And so, I have a lot of visibility across both early stage, like what are portfolio companies doing, but that scales all the way through to my investors who are now, the CEOs of major public companies.
Yeah, who I'm sure still struggling with it or still investing in it today, even working on it still.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is a lot of these features are really hard to build. And so I think especially for early stage companies, it's always the question, of a risk and reward trade-off. There's also a question of just like raw engineering power. Like, do you have the people that are able to build a lot of these features? And do you have, is there a strong enough market signal, and is it worth reorienting the ship towards like these larger customers? And so I think you do have, it is a delicate balance of what is your product team able to deliver? What sort of signals are you getting from your customers, and what sort of inbound are you seeing naturally, which to me is a strong signal, because if you're seeing inbound, then with a little bit of outbound, you can actually, that's a strong market signal where I do spend a lot of time with companies going through, users on the wait list, looking at market signals that can come from GitHub. Like I spend a lot of time more on the research side to understand, is there a strong enough demand for us to move our market faster? And are there ways for us to, start to stabilize the platform in a way where you can unlock larger enterprise contracts faster?
Yeah, that's a really interesting moment for companies when they kind of have those first kind of few like baby enterprise organizations, or maybe the first few seeds that can grow into something larger. Definitely with WorkOS, we focus on the technical aspect of crossing that chasm and actually going to those customers. I know that you spend a lot of time talking to your portfolio about like go-to-market and positioning and stuff. I'm curious if you could chat about like what are the other challenges as you navigate that you see across all these different companies that might be building super different products but are kind of hitting the same challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, market positioning is step one. And so one thing that I do notice a lot is, especially in the world of founders that are used to building features, shipping and announcing them on Product Hunt, or, using Twitter as a great way of kind of building a hyper local audience and kind of scaling their own reputation in the ecosystem. What I do find is that from a team and culture standpoint, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what it means to build an enterprise company. And so this is where I get really excited about this next wave of developer-friendly infrastructure. I find in a lot of ways, and I experienced this firsthand at Zendesk, where, I think that especially for product-minded founders, the concept of building and scaling a sales team, or the concept of actually like having these two worlds, like both product and engineering and go-to-market come together, it actually can change the company culturally. It can also lead to a pretty, inflated headcount depending on how you scope for the sales org. And so what I have been spending a lot of time on is really thinking through, to what extent can you actually layer in developer-friendly infrastructure where you can start to experiment and iterate and stabilize your product, your platform in a much smoother and efficient way than hiring more engineers, than hiring sales reps. And so I do really believe that the future of startups will be a lot more leaner and capital efficient. And that capital efficiency is coming from a lot of APIs and like single line of code tools that we didn't have previously. And so if anything, it's like having a really lean and highly efficient engineering team is enabling the next generation of startups, because we can essentially, I think WorkOS is a great example. You can focus on world-class features that engineers don't want to build anyway. And that puts you in a really interesting position in the ecosystem, because I think there's a lot of these features and values that we as startups would love to deliver for our customers, but we don't quite have the engineering team or the go-to-market motion to ship it as quickly as we'd like to.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels to earlier infrastructure companies, not even that early, things like AWS, right? Where you used to have to literally like rack machines in a data center. Everybody needs that. Now companies don't even have to think about it, all the way to now even like the way people deploy code is changing with things like Netlify. You don't even have to think about running an application. It's running like Lambdas or serverless endpoints. I think that transition is really interesting to me, as we find that so much gets shared across different companies that the modern SaaS app, really, you can focus exclusively on writing code that's only unique to your product and not have to do anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think from an internal team standpoint, I love the next generation of software companies, because you end up attracting, like, I think that talent problem fit is a real thing, where there's a lot of startups that you can work at lately. And I think especially, as we look at this new world of remote work, like, engineers can work anywhere. You can work at Shopify, which is actually growing and doing quite well. You can go all the way to an early stage startup and join from the very beginning. I just think that there are so many great places for engineers to work right now. And so what's awesome to see is like a lot of the new developer-friendly infrastructure, or I look at even a lot of the new design tools like Figma. If you're a designer, Figma is honestly the best place for you to possibly work, because you're solving a problem that you know firsthand. You're in a like highly creative environment. You're kind of like amongst your own people. And so I see that a lot with dev tools, where whether you're interested in helping companies go enterprise ready, you want to meet companies at this sort of inflection point where self-serve is working. Therefore, the company itself is fairly de-risked, and you get to spend time with like really great high growth startups, which is why I'm very excited about all of the individuals that are on the call, and just the quality of early WorkOS customers, just because it's like they're obviously naturally really business inclined and thinking about stabilizing the platform and layering in additional revenue, and so that makes a great place to work. So I think like over time, it's like it's never been easier to start a startup. I also see a shift towards startups going incredibly deep on a certain feature set, a certain user base, a certain problem space. And so I find, if anything, it's a really exciting time to join startups too.
Yeah, going deep, like you mentioned, one thing I was thinking about the other night was how there's so many of these companies that were written off early, just a feature. Like Dropbox is kind of famous in this way, that like Steve Jobs said, oh, it's just a feature, you're not going to be a real company. Turns out it's a tremendous business and a huge company. And something like DocuSign also, right? Which at first blush would be like, that's just a feature. And to me, it feels like there's just, the whole industry is so deep that if you find a niche, at first blush, it might look shallow, but it turns out there's a huge business to be built in any of these, vertical niches, right? Like,
yeah, I agree with that.
It's a whole industry.
Yeah, it's amazing to see in a lot of ways, and I'm saying this, as an investor, the markets are often so much larger than anyone can actually predict. And so I think in any instance when an investor says like, oh, I predicted that, it's nearly impossible to predict, because I think what ends up happening is, You can look at Zoom is a great example of this. Zoom did not invent video conferencing. In fact, there were many predecessors with varying degrees of quality and success. But what's interesting about Zoom is Zoom went very, very deep on their own tech stack. And actually like really investing in product, really going deep on, certain aspects of the business, it's essentially become like such a defensible moat long term, because they continue to really invest in their technology, and they continue to, yes, partner with the right people when it makes sense, but their product philosophy is listen to customers, build quickly, and rinse and repeat. And so I think that like that ability to keep going deeper and deeper with customers is something that you can find, you can unlock additional revenue over time, but it all goes back to like how much time are you spending with your customers, and are you shipping the features that they actually are asking for?
Yeah, I've been just floored with Zoom. I think since I first discovered it through some folks at Emergence Capital, like Santi and those crew. I think I got an invite from him once, and I was like, "What is this?" Years later, it's just dominating how we all work, especially even before COVID. The surprising thing to me about this stuff too is, it's really the market that you pick. The market will keep expanding. I saw recently that PayPal is, I think, like a $230 billion company now. And a lot of people don't even talk about PayPal anymore, but they were such a formative point, and that whole ecosystem has grown around them. The same thing I think is happening with Zoom, where more and more people are going to be working online, more and more people are going to grow. Same thing with Stripe, same thing with Shopify. These things that feel like features initially, if you're at the cusp of a wave, you just kind of have to keep going straight forward, and there'll be a massive, massive market in no time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I know like we're both very excited about the future of APIs and, developer friendly infra as well. And I think what's really interesting there is, if you look at businesses like Twilio, if you look at any of the high growth, now public examples that we have, many of their early customers started out on, really simple pricing plans, and they scaled into monster accounts. And so I think what's awesome is that, once you get this self-serve flywheel going for a developer tool, and once you have that amazing product turns into developer evangelism, turns into early customers, I think that is such that's the benefit of having these sort of business models. I think where I'm getting, increasingly excited is the fact that, to what extent have many of these companies actually foregone large enterprise accounts, or foregone really stabilizing their product sooner rather than later. And quite frankly, we've talked about this, where historically it's been really hard to move up market, knowing when to do it, knowing to what extent do you need to hire and build out a much larger team. And so I think in a lot of ways, had something like WorkOS existed earlier, I just think it would completely change the trajectory of companies like Slack or companies like Twilio, because if anything, having a single line of code, or having a trusted partner who's going really, really deep and deeper than you would as a startup trying to build your own team internally, I just think that there's a lot of opportunity for companies to actually move even faster than the last generation.
I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, I see it as being this risk that you're introduced when you start going up market, because you don't know what technically you have to do. There's security stuff you have to think about, and building out a sales team is expensive. I mean, you have to ramp people, you have to think about training material, and if you can push that off for as long as possible and capture that revenue through other means, even if it's bigger deals, you can start to build that revenue foundation for the business. I have this blog post I think I want to write someday, all about the $1 million self-serve product. So the idea that you just put in a credit card, and then a couple of years later, you're paying a vendor like $1 million a year. There's very few products that are like that, but they're kind of ones that we all look up to. Things like maybe AWS or Twilio or Stripe, right? A customer like Shopify or Slack or something. I think Slack started off probably on Stripe early on, and has scaled, to tremendous volume on that. And being able to get started early on and have that kind of zero friction, I think it just kind of changes the model for how B2B companies can scale. completely.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot about net dollar retention, and I also think a lot about, to what extent will this next wave of developer tools be even stickier than the last generation? And I think now that you have, a whole class of engineers who have grown up in an era of low code and no code, you have an appreciation for problem solving, but you can solve great problems without incurring additional headcount. And so I'm seeing this already where, I think the previous generation, there was more of a build versus buy mentality. I also think it spoke more to the nature of corporate America and big companies, where I think historically there was a little bit more of, there was a more of a culture around building a large engineering team. There was a more of a culture around like mirroring corporate America and applying that to tech companies. What I'm seeing today is that, I think the grow at all costs and being like grow at all costs for headcount has gone away. Where if anything, there's so much amazing tech that's available off the shelf with some levels of customization, where I actually think like the whole way that we are building and shipping products in the future will be more around finding the right partners, stitching things together and like having your own opinion on the world. But I think it frees up engineers to spend a lot more time thinking about, what is part of core product, like what are customer facing features and what are the issues that should be built, the problems that should be solved internally, rather than over investing on, non-core features or things that you could just buy off the shelf from experts who know what they're doing.
Yeah, this is something we try to focus on internally too. I mean, it's not even that it becomes cheaper, not necessarily. It's really just about focus. Like every hour you don't think about building some internal tool or something that's, you could buy off the shelf. That's an hour that you could spend talking to a user and actually building for them, like unique features for them. It's just team focus and alignment. And we're both friends with Justin. Like we use Retool a ton internally to build internal systems, and I don't even know how much time we've saved from that. You mentioned other systems like low code and no code systems, which I know you're really passionate about. Do you see that kind of figuring into this too? Retool being one of those potentially?
Yeah, I think Retool is part of this. I was an angel investor in Webflow. I'm seeing this on the design side of things where as companies are starting to scale back, they're starting to be increasingly capital efficient. I think as you hire fewer but more senior or specialized individuals inside of even early stage companies, I'm seeing this a lot more where it's less about hire fast, fire fast, and some of these like previous YC methodologies. I think if anything, fewer but more specialized teammates gives, the entire team a lot of confidence and ensures a lot of accountability. And so I find, if anything, the next generation of startups are, I would say, lower ego. I think there's something really great in saying, like, rather than trying to build it ourselves, which introduces a lot of risk for the company, it starts to shift focus. It starts to be unclear on like what are non-core versus core like priorities. And so I think if anything, there's a new wave of building and shipping products, and I do see no code playing a huge part in this. Where I'm also an investor in a company called Mux, which is a video API for streaming. Like, there's a lot of these new things where the problem that a lot of the dev-friendly infrastructure, a lot of the problems being solved are really technically complex. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense to build your own engineering team for this one non-core feature or for this one piece of critical infrastructure, where at the end of the day, like having a trusted partner who has hundreds of thousands of customers rather than relying on your internal team where they're maybe figuring it out for the first time. I just think over time it really starts to, de-risk what you're building. It also gives your own customers a lot of confidence as well.
I wanted to ask you about remote work too. You mentioned this, and we've talked about remote work for a while. WorkOS has been a remote distributed team really since the beginning. I mean, for over a year and a half now. COVID's not going away anytime soon. We're all transitioning and adjusting to this. I live in San Francisco. I see like the hills of SF and behind you also. But people are leaving cities and companies are adapting to this. What are you seeing from, across your portfolio, potentially as well as you think about new products to invest in, how the market's evolving, how the landscape's changing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I started WorkLife, and one of the core themes even less than a year ago, prior to COVID, was that a large percentage of people already wanted to work from home, or they were at least working from home 1 day per week, and so the whole concept of remote work wasn't new. If anything, it was popularized by big companies that have different offices, or they have a lot more documentation, and it makes it a lot easier for individuals to work remotely. What I'm seeing post COVID is that, I think in a lot of ways it's forcing startups in particular to operate like small companies. And so I say this specifically because I think a lot of investors will say startups aren't companies, they're experiments. Until you find product market fit, until you actually, stabilize what you're working on, it's kind of a quirky experiment. I actually disagree because I find, if anything, startups now have an incredible amount of pressure to have the same level of documentation, employee onboarding, remote HR best practices as a medium to large size company. And so I think it's put a lot of pressure on a lot of early stage teams. Um, for me personally, I've been spending a lot of my time, especially with new hires that have joined during COVID, doing a lot of coaching calls, asking if I can help individual employees find, one or two mentors at other companies. I think there's a lot to be said for how we're actually building and encouraging and coaching individual employees on our teams. I think this is especially important when it comes to product and engineering cultures as well, where I do think a lot about employee burnout, and we're already starting to see that a little bit. I think especially as the honest truth with distributed teams is, we can implement systems and processes and really cool tools. We can't solve for time zones. And so I am finding there are a lot of people that are working extra hours or strange hours to accommodate other team members. And so, I think there's a lot of questions around, how quickly can we help early stage companies really think about structured documentation, a more formal employee onboarding. I am thinking a lot about career coaching and education because I think that there's so much to be said for sitting next to not necessarily your boss, because your boss is oftentimes in a lot of meetings, but having those peer groups that naturally form inside of companies are really important. And so I have been looking at a lot of productivity tools that help with that. I was an early investor in Tandem, which is a YC company that's a virtual office for remote teams. And Tandem's awesome because in a lot of ways, like the features that I love and use daily are more, it's more team building. It's more like the fact that you can actually jump into a water cooler room, have these like cool, interesting, like ad hoc conversations with the people that you work with and want to get to know more personally. I also love that like there's a Spotify integration and you can see what songs people are playing, or you can just have a little bit more of an open office vibe. Another thing, and like kind of building on that, is I think that works well for young tech workers, or I would say people who are, pre-kids. I definitely have a lot of empathy for parents right now and just see like late night emails that are coming through, and just parents are really like juggling a lot. And so, WorkLife is primarily dev tools, design tools. It's a lot of modern enterprise companies, but we do think a lot about, to what extent can we actually view education and culture and a lot of these really important critical topics to the workplace as part of the broader work-life conversation.
Yeah, I feel like managing people remotely is a totally different set. Maybe not of skills, but you kind of have to take a different attitude around it too. Not being able to see people in the office or kind of have a walk around the block type of conversation. We've definitely created systems internally for communicating both around kind of making decisions and process, but also culturally, so people can have time to hang out together. It feels like a lot of the remote work stuff is so heavily focused on productivity, just getting stuff done and shipping, but people also want to enjoy spending time around their coworkers and having fun too. And kind of have to
I
like,
love I mean, I'll say like one of the highlights of work from home so far. I love that Justin Gage, who's currently a retool and helps WorkOS, I love that he did a technical writing workshop for the team. Because I think if anything, like there are just there are all these topics and things that, ideally we'd love to learn on evenings and weekends, or these are sort of like work related hobbies or passion projects. But I think that it's that's one of those things that's been on my to-do list for a long time, where I'd love to spend more time on technical writing. It's one of those things that I never quite get to. And so I think a lot of like lunch and learns, even bringing in, individuals from other companies. Or one thing that we did at Zendesk that I really loved was just customer conversations. Like bring in an interesting customer, have them share their story, have them talk through how they're using the product. I think that there are so many ways to really kind of encourage the team to have a lot more empathy and a lot more respect and appreciation for individual customers. And I think oftentimes those lunch and learns or those opportunities to tell a story, it's both helpful in terms of internal education. It's also really fun too. Like I've found now that I'm an investor, I've had a chance to co-invest with previous Zendesk customers. Like you run into people, well, not during COVID, but you run into people at social events. And so I think it's just always great to continue building that ecosystem and continue finding opportunities to really let individual customers shine as well.
yeah, it's been interesting during this time not having those social events or those, just like walking around downtown SF or in South Park bumping into people. You've been running these kind of I don't know what to call them, like small events with people that are like this, which is kind of it's sort of, it feels like a conversation or a mix between like a dinner party or like people sitting around having drinks together. And that's been like really useful to bridge that.
Yeah, it's been awesome to see. So I've been hosting events 3 nights a week actually. And so we have found that I think while there is Zoom fatigue during the day, there's also an appetite to meet new people. And so I find, whether it's, 15, 20 different people, like we did, I hosted a head of people and culture event to talk about remote work best practices. And so we had 100% opt-in rate. We had head of people and culture from Cameo, Webflow, Reddit, like all of these amazing tech companies, because we all had a shared appetite to really understand, like, what do we do next? Yeah. And so I think a lot of these quiet conversations are really what makes, the tech ecosystem. I would say Silicon Valley, it's now the tech ecosystem globally, because we had people dialed in from all over the world. It's just great to see like how quickly people will come together around an idea. It was also fascinating to hear, to what extent are tech companies getting rid of their real estate? When we return back to work, what does that look like? And so a lot of teams had said they're introducing socially distant, like box lunches that get delivered to your desk. And so I find in a lot of ways we're all adjusting to this new normal, but it's great to see to what extent startups in particular or companies that are thinking about a specific problem related to remote work, like can we come together and have thoughtful conversations around tactically what should we do?
Yeah, I think there's a big question on what's the world going to be like after this for, Dylan wrote this post about the approach that they're taking at Figma, where they're going to kind of do partially in office and out of office. And I think a lot of it is like so product dependent what you're building too. For us, writing pure software APIs for developers fits really nicely with being able to work fully remote and have a fully distributed team. We have people all the way fully across the United States and beyond. Really hard if you're doing any biomedical stuff,
yeah,
or any hardware stuff, or energy, or even something where it's like a design agency. Sometimes the digital tools aren't quite there yet.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think GitHub has made some really great moves throughout COVID as well. I think making, certain aspects of the product free for everyone was a really smart move. I think the introduction of profiles is essentially like removing the need for something like LinkedIn, and it's like everyone who is technical can stay in GitHub for most of the day or get all the information they need there. And so I find, if anything, we're very lucky to be part of this, like part of the tech ecosystem where, once you get into your own rhythm for working remotely, and once you sort of find your communities online, I've heard from a lot of individuals, especially, product engineering design, where people are like quite happy at home. Once you get your setup in place and once you figure out, how to have productive conversations with coworkers and find a shared sense of community professionally, I think that it's interesting to see just the types of conversations that individuals are having on a per team basis. I've heard the opposite for sales, and so I think that's where it's kind of like technical versus non-technical, or like product and engineering versus sales and marketing. And so I have heard, I think that I think that there is something great about being in an office. There is something great about celebrating customer wins together. I don't think, like, as someone who hosts a lot of events over Zoom, it's not the same as getting together and having a dinner. Like, it tends to be shorter. The conversations are a little bit more transactional. But I think that people crave community, and there are also just questions that people need answered. And so oftentimes answering those questions in a group format enables a discussion, and it allows people to build relationships, which they can catch up one-on-one, offline after.
It's my hope too that all this work that we're doing, for people moving to distributed teams or remote work, to some degree it benefits the people that want to move out of Silicon Valley and go live somewhere else. But really what's driven me to be more passionate about it, and like why we're wanting to support these products with WorkOS too, it hugely democratizes access to working at tech companies for people across the world. You can live, in a totally different region, maybe where your family is, maybe you can't relocate, to the most expensive real estate in the country, and yet still have access to work at these types of companies, get some like equity upside, participate in this like big shift happening in the world. Whereas previously you were kind of out of luck. Now everyone can work at like a hot Silicon Valley company, not just, the tech bros or whatever.
I love it. No, I love it. Prior to COVID, I went on a trip to Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a mix of VCs and some early stage founders. And Tulsa, I would say, is really interesting because great restaurants, great bar scenes. If you're into architecture and design, they have the most amount of Art Deco buildings outside of Miami and New York. And so you kind of drive into this really cool, but kind of underrated town, and one that I would never typically go to for a vacation. But they have this program called Tulsa Remote, which I think is awesome. They basically, give you a stipend. It's already a really affordable place to live. It's already like a really safe and friendly city. And so they essentially set up the stipend program and went to GitHub, GitLab, Facebook, any primarily technical teams that would, be interested in relocating and just kind of, trying out a different life for a while. And so I ended up meeting a lot of them were native Tulsans who wanted to move back home. Maybe they recently had a kid, or maybe they're just, rethinking what's next. But there were some folks that had relocated from New York where, it's kind of fun to go live somewhere else for 6 to 12 months. And so I think right now, it is an interesting time where I think that people can be a lot more creative, both personally and professionally. And so I am encountering a lot of individuals who are choosing to freelance for a while, choosing to live somewhere differently. I just feel like there's a lot more optionality, and the future is a lot more flexible. And so I feel like in a lot of ways that kind of ties into just the broader where is work going. I think that when you have, people who are able to choose companies and move pretty fluidly from one company to the next, you also have like a lot of these new tools and processes that make it, I don't want to say easy. The job is still incredibly hard, but I think that there are ways of really like thoughtfully building your career and being a lot more flexible, whether that's like choosing a new company, moving to a new city. I am pretty excited because it does seem like, you catch up with friends who had been working on, actually, I experienced this a lot. I was previously at Expedia. A lot of my Expedia friends have gone to Uber or Lyft, or, got put into some of these medium to large size tech companies, and they were working on internal tooling. And so I definitely love the whole vision for Retool and a lot of these new ways of building internal tools, because you join a company, you want to work on core products, you want to work on like the coolest new thing that you're building. However, like something comes up and you end up getting pulled into a different project or into a different org. And so I think if anything, one thing that I look at, especially before I make a new investment, is really understanding like, to what extent do developers want to build this thing? Because I think if you remove a lot of the boring aspects of a job, and now we're also introducing more flexibility. So we're removing boring aspects of the day-to-day. We're also enabling people to live wherever they want. I just am already seeing a pretty significant shift in just overall quality of life, and especially for individuals that are working at tech companies.
And everyone wins. It's like good for the whole world. It's not, nothing really that's lost to that.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and it's cheaper, right? We can cut back on our office spend.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to ask you to wrap up. So you're an investor, full on. I've been writing a lot of checks, investing in a lot of exciting companies. What type of founders do you like chatting with? What type of companies do you like, investing in? We have a bunch of people on the call who are, working at early stage companies or founders themselves. Who should reach out to you? What do you look for? How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, first things first, I would love to meet anyone that wants to catch up on, developer tools, future of work stuff. I would say the great thing about the work-life model, I am not a career VC. I was an operator for years, product at Expedia, self-serve growth, and, sort of scalable go-to-market at Zendesk. I run a program, as you know, once a quarter called SaaS School. And so I love just like getting to know people in the ecosystem. And so from a work-life standpoint, mostly investing in seed Series A and, following on to Series B and beyond. Primarily like developer tools, infrastructure, spending a little bit more time in sort of the new creator economy. Because I think there's something really interesting there, where I was an early angel investor in Dev.to. I spent a lot of time in the GitHub ecosystem. I love like understanding to what extent can you commercialize open source projects, and like, can we actually turn, great technical ideas into full-blown venture-backed companies? And so I'm always down to just catch up on projects and what people are working on. And WorkLife, new website is live. It's worklife.vc. And then I'm at Brianne Kimmel on Twitter.
Cool. Well, everyone, please reach out to Brianne if you want to chat. Thanks so much for joining us. This is really fun. It's good to catch up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great. Feel free to send questions my way. I'd love to catch up with people.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone for attending. Take care. See you at the next one.